Hello, everyone, and greeting. I'm Jennifer Keller, Programming Coordinator at the Westport Library. You may have guessed today, we are streaming this event from the library's Trev's Forum because we have two award-winning Westport authors here today. And hopefully this will all work out A1. So, today we're going to be talking with Michaela MacColl and Lauren Tarshis. Michaela's new book, which you can see on the screen, which Pagoda Hill, View from Pagoda Hill, came out earlier this year. And she is an award-winning author of 10 historical novels for middle school and young adult readers, including The Lost Ones, Secrets in the Snow, and Promise the Night. She studied Russian and Soviet history and lived in the south of France for several years before settling in Connecticut in Westport. View from Pagoda Hill is her latest novel and the first about her own family. Lauren Tarshis is author to 21 I Survived books, a New York Times bestselling series, and is the editor of Storyworks magazine. As I said, both authors live in Westport, and we are so excited to have them back on stage at the same time. Please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we'll ask as many as we have time for at the end of the discussion. The web page for purchasing View from Pagoda Hill will stay live through 10 p.m. tonight in case you'd like to buy a bookplate signed copy right after the event. Don't do it now. Wait until after the event because we're going to have fun. So without further ado, Lauren and Michaela, take it away.
We were just saying that we feel like we're just sort of sitting together, having our wine, and having the chance to talk about writing. And Michaela, I remember the first time I met you, but do you remember the time when we were together at Kindling Words?
I do, yes. And I just published my first book, and Lauren knew everyone, and I knew no one.
Well, but I remember this was a writing retreat that you win by lottery, right? It's like you have to sign up and you get to go, and it was in Vermont, right? Mm-hmm. But I remember hearing you read your Emily Dickinson. It was in progress. And I remember sitting in the audience, and my feeling was jealousy. I thought it was so beautiful the way, Emily Dickinson, you made her seem so modern and relevant, and you brought her to life in just a few sentences. And I have to say that this book, as I have shared with Michaela, was absolutely captivating. And your writing is, you just have this truly singular way of bringing to life a person and a place. And this book is so many different things. It's a historical fiction novel set in 19th century China. So you're taking readers to this fascinating land. You're taking them to Shanghai, which you bring to life all of the smells and sounds and people and crowds. It's an incredible, incredible mother-daughter story. It's an incredible story about belonging, about prejudice, about class, about being biracial. And that's not all, because it's a family story. It's a story connected to your family history. So, what do you say to all that?
Oh, well, thank you for those kind words, and thank you for being here, and thanks to the Westport Library. This is my home base, so it's really exciting to be here. View from Pagoda Hill is a story that I came up with, I think, even before I got published. I had a draft of, a pitch for this, because it's a story that's so useful for dinner parties or cocktail parties. I had an ancestor, from China. She came here as a little girl, and she ended up in upstate New York, with these grandparents who didn't know what to do with her, but they really loved her, and she was lonely, and they put a pagoda on the barn. And you tell that story, and it's interesting. People chat about it. So it seemed like, of course there's a book there. We've done so much more with less. But it turned out to be so much less than more. I wrote that book 10, 15 times. I have an editor who does not ever settle, which is frustrating at times, but at the end, if she lets it go, it's probably okay. And when Lauren was talking about all those different things the book is, I'm like, oh, no wonder I had to write it 10, 12 times. It's a wonder I didn't write it 20 times. So it's a story that's near to me, and it's especially important to my mom. So we got very close writing that book. You know, she read every draft. And it was funny because an early draft, my mother was not happy with how I portrayed her great-great-grandfather. And she said to me, you know, Michaela, you know, you've made it into a story, but these are my ancestors. And I looked at her and I said, but Mom, A, that's what I do. You know, I write stories. And B, they're my ancestors too. And by the end, I think I sort of convinced her, because now we talk about these people and my version has come out more on top. Although today she told me that it was like a game of telephone, you know, where she whispers something into my ear and it comes out in the book a different way, and a kid will read this book and have a different impression altogether. But she does call me whenever I make a mistake, so she's trying to make sure the record is as correct as we can make it.
But of course, this is, you write historical fiction. So that's always tricky, because you do have to bring to life your place and your event with extreme accuracy. So there's huge research involved, and then you have the freedom to create characters. But of course, the characters have to be, they have to be inspired by real people and realistic, So I would love to hear you talk about the process. First of all, tell us a little bit, who are these characters? Share with those who might not have yet read the book. Who is this girl?
So the heroine of my story is named Nina. She has a different name in China, but Nina is the name that we know her by in America. And she came to the United States when she was about 6. And she's half Chinese, half American. Her father was from upstate New York. And we end up with the pagoda on the barn. I mean, that's the story. We're going to get from somehow arriving from China to a place where a very upright pillar of society, high Episcopalian man named Erastus will paint an enormous pagoda on a barn facing the road out into his fields, in upstate New York. So I had to make up a lot of story. I mean, I had to use every bit of skill I've learned for historical fiction to find similar stories to give some weight to what I knew, because I didn't know a lot. And the research for China was very tricky. Much easier in the U.S. because the town's still there. There's a great historical society there that was helpful. But if we're going to talk about research, trying to do anything about China in the 1860s is almost impossible.
Right.
History's been rewritten there so many times, especially in Shanghai. When we went, my husband and I went to visit, and I found a guide through the Preserve Old Shanghai Society, and he'd grown up in Shanghai, and he said, do you see all those, hundreds and hundreds of skyscrapers? He's like, that's where I was born, in a little farmhouse, and it's gone. And China, and Shanghai in particular, it's been rebuilt, and there is very little left. Unless it's a tourist site or something that's so religious that they can't tear it down, it's up for grabs, it's up for development. So that was really difficult. I ended up relying on a lot of first-hand accounts of expatriates who lived there. And it's a very odd society, even more odd than a usual expatriate society is, because at the time that my great-great-grandfather went there, 3 greats, triple great-grandfather, went to China, Shanghai had been divided into sections. It was the English section and the American section and the French section, and that was by treaty, a treaty that was dictated by, British warboats. So he's going to a China that, A, doesn't exist now, and at the time, the China part was confined to the original city. So they're almost prisoners in these original stone walls, and the parts along the river, the better parts of town to live in, are all foreigners, and Chinese are not welcome.
Right. Amazing. I mean, there's so many things. If you would take, even though Michaela said, no, I don't want to talk about that before this, I beg you to share with us, because it's so fascinating. This Shanghai, and was always this remarkable singular city, of very international, and just you brought it to life so vividly in the book. These, this mishmash of all these different cultures. So tell us, what would have brought your great 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 grandfather from to Shanghai, which takes 6 months, a 6-month journey by boat. What would have brought, and many American businessmen, this was a place of commerce, this was a very sophisticated, would you say?
Yeah. Shanghai was a place where you could get very, very rich. And it was an old boys' club, very few women. And he came there because his company, which was a manufacturing company in Troy, New York, called Osgood Manufacturing, had built a dredge. And the dredge was a machine that would scoop up silt from the bottom of a canal so that boats with a deeper draft could go in them. 2 or 3 years ago, I was down at Campo Basin, and they had a dredge there. I was so excited. And I went down, and because the silt had come in and boats were getting stuck. And especially when we weren't as experienced boaters as we are now, we used to get stuck before we understood how the harbor worked. And I was looking at this boat, and I was like, how does it work? And the guy said, I don't know, I hit a button, and dirt scoops. But that's what he was doing there. He was scooping out a canal. And he mentions the Suzhou Canal, which leads to a city called Suzhou, which is inland and was famous for being incredibly wealthy and incredibly beautiful. Today, it's still a World Heritage Site. It is beautiful. And he was there to facilitate commerce. He was there to facilitate the Westerners being able to do business in the interior. Right. Those treaties controlled all of the big port cities, but they wanted more. And honestly, one of the reasons they wanted more was the British wanted to sell opium, further inland.
So that brings up, well, there's 2 things I want to ask you about. The first thing I think is important to really situate ourselves in what was happening in America at that time. So this is right after the end of the Civil War. That's your great-great-great-grandfather. So America was sort of, special. The South is in ruins, and this is a time of turbocharged, feverish development, right? Now we're going to move forward, reunited. So the idea of a young man like George about deciding to strike, to have these adventures is a very kind of just trying to imagine that. And then he meets, how does this happen in your mind? How does he end up falling in love or having we don't know.
We do not know.
With your great-great-great-grandmother.
No. My mother always told me that she thought that Sun, Nina's mother, was actually a courtesan. And we all thought this was so romantic. Just bizarre now that I think about it. So unpolitically correct right now. But that she was somehow this, elegant woman who was given to him by a merchant, and that's possible. However, when I went to China and I was talking to my guide, who was a real history buff, and I showed him the pictures, like, And I said, why not? He's like, I remember arguing about him in the middle of a very crowded street in Shanghai. I'm like, no, she could have been. And he's like, no, she couldn't. I'm like, how do you know? And he's like, well, look, she's dressed like a lady. And I've got a picture of her that I'll show later that she is dressed like a lady. I was like, besides, she's not pretty enough.
Right.
I was crushed.
Well, I think she's very beautiful from the picture.
I thought so too, but apparently she did not have the refinement that you might expect from a high-priced courtesan.
You had to learn the truth sometime.
I know. It was a blow. Although it did make it a little easier to write a book for middle grade. If she had been a courtesan, I might have ended up in the young adult arena.
Right. Well, but of course you were allowed, so you had this really interesting challenge to do all this research, to bring this time and place to life, then to take these fragments of your family history that had been passed down to you, plus some artifacts that had been handed down, and then sort of putting all of these elements together into a story that was exciting and relevant to middle graders. So I think it would be great to share, to give people a glimpse of sort of what, these fragments of your family history that inspired you to write this book?
I love to share these pictures,
Yeah.
so that's no problem at all.
And these are all in the back, and many of them are in the back of the book as well. Not working.
Okay, I'm sorry. Did I turn it off somehow? Thank you. Okay. I started with a map from the 1860s because when I went to China, it was a big deal. You know, am I going to have enough Ambien? How are we going to get dehydrated? And it took us 24 hours. Of course, right now, flying to Boston would be a big deal.
Right.
But back then, as you said, it's a 6-month journey. And we know that it's a 6-month journey by sail. So if you look at the United States, up where New York is, George, when he first goes to Shanghai in the 1860s, will go down, he'll hug the American coast and get to the northern part of South America, and then cut over, go around the Cape of Good Hope, and then we have to go to the other side of the Mercator map. And he'll go through the Arabian Sea and the Indian Sea and the South China Sea and the China Sea. Actually, I was so excited when I came up with Nina's journey, 7 seas. I was very excited to have her do that. And it's a crazy journey. And we know about that journey because he wrote a journal of his. This is George. Now you'd think that a journal, every person who writes historical fiction, that's gold. You know, you've got his own words, it's a contemporary account. And his journal of his journey to Shanghai is the dullest thing you've ever read. It is, every day that he's journeying, it tells us what the wind was like and how many knots they covered.
Well, that was very typical, right? I mean, that was a very typical, people weren't trying to document their emotions.
But think how inconsiderate that
was
is
very
to his
rude.
descendants.
Exactly.
That he had this amazing journey that he didn't tell us anything.
He was very, he's very dashing.
I think he's a little
He's
dapper.
very dashing.
Yeah. I like to lean against the column.
I do too.
Now, he was a wanderer. He wandered his whole life. During the Civil War, he actually ended up in the South. He was doing business when the war broke out. And I'm sorry to say that he enlisted on the side of the South.
Oh, dear.
He did.
Oh, my goodness.
We have a journal of that, too, which is pretty uninteresting, except for the place where he says that he really didn't care one way or the other, but he'd rather not have African Americans boss him around. He did not use those exact words. The words he used were much more colorful.
This was, I think, a really fascinating thing as a reader to read this, because he comes off, he does not come out well in this at all.
First, the journal was a wash, and then he was fighting for the South.
He's a terrible racist. So, but he's also, and I was wondering, because as your mother says, these are your relatives. This is not a fictional character who you are creating. And you, as a writer of historical fiction, you have all the license you could possibly want to completely recharacterize him and make him much more of a hero.
I did. He was a great guy. He was a middling guy. He was a rotten guy.
Everything. Yeah.
I tried every way. But ultimately, I came back to the guy who would write a journal and not give me any information to work with.
Okay, so you punished him.
I did. He is an absent great-great-great-grandfather. And he only has 2 or 3 chapters in the book, really.
Yeah.
I have him come in and do something incredibly awful to his daughter and then disappear.
Yeah.
And I kept, when we get to America, which is the second half of the book, I kept worrying, what do I do with him? If he comes back, what's it going to do to her, to the life she's trying to build? Is it going to be a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Are they going to reconcile? What's going to happen?
And I don't think we've established that for Nina, who was called Ning when she was in China. Mm-hmm. She is absolutely caught in an abyss between 2 cultures. Yes. Because her mother is from a well-born family and has bound feet, which we'll hear all about.
Yeah.
And
this is his dredge.
This dredge. But
this is her mother.
There she is. So you've got son who is well-bred and wants, has a daughter who she would very much want to marry off. Her obligation is to marry her off. But she knows, because she has a daughter who is mixed race.
Race and who does not have bound feet.
Does not have bound feet. That she's basically unmarriageable. So now she has to look, her only hope for her daughter's future is this man who abandoned them, and now who could potentially is going to take her 7 seas away where she will never
And
see
it's
her
a
again.
journey where she's not going to come back.
She
we know
won't
that.
come back.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a lot of fun writing Son because I really thought that this is a woman who was just trying to do the best for her daughter. But having this daughter who is mixed race and whose feet are not bound makes her an albatross around her mother's neck.
You did that. I thought that was, to me, I can imagine the 10 or more drafts of trying to find this nuance, because Son does come off in the end. I became very attached to her, even though she, is not the most loving mother.
She's not at all.
And she's ashamed of her her
Yes.
daughter. But she has this great sense of duty and obligation.
And I think every decision she's made is for her daughter's sake.
So now for the bound feet. This is, I think, in every novel or short story, there is that one, when you're searching for kind of a catalyst for the story.
Why does the story start now?
Yes.
Yes.
It's not, so for you, it was bound feet.
I think in real life, it was bound feet because here's Nina. And
Well, explain to us who might not be initiated into the world of bound feet. What does that even mean?
Well, if you look at Son's feet, they're very, very tiny. And this is a pair of shoes that Nina brought to the United States. I have this pair of shoes that are about this big. And they're handmade and they've never been worn, which is, sort of poignant. Your voice catches just thinking about a pair of shoes for a child that were never worn. But this would have been a pair of shoes for an adult. And foot binding in China was something that every young woman of quality would do. And it is, I worked to find pictures that were not too horrific, but it's pretty horrific. Starting when a child was 4 or 5, they would bind their feet where they're trying to take the toes and curl them into the arch. So they would wrap them with wet cloths that would then dry and shrink. And then they would force children to walk on their toes until they broke them over and over and over again. So as they healed, they would keep breaking them until they would be tiny. And this would end up with women would walk on the knuckles of their feet and they would totter, and it was considered very, very beautiful. In fact, in Suzhou, where Son is from, they were famous for their lotus blossom women who tottered like lotus blossoms in the wind. So at the age of 5, Son would have had to make a decision to do this to her daughter or not. And if her father was there then, I don't know if he was. Somehow, I can't imagine any American father buying into, maiming his daughter. I can't get my head around that. So I think that was probably what brought her to America, that she wouldn't have a future in China with her big feet. So America was a better choice. Now, in my novel, the problem is that 6 is a very tough age to write about. It's just too young. So it was a real challenge trying to come up with a real catalyst that involves the feet, but gives me a reason to start at 12. And I came up with instead matchmaking.
Right.
That a matchmaker comes, and she's the matchmaker of last resort.
Yes,
she's the one who she can find a husband for anybody. And she says, no, I can't, not for her. So that is what pushes her mother to do something desperate. It also pushes Ning, she's called Ning in China. Her father gives her a new name to go to America. It pushes her to try to do some desperate things as well, to wish on dragons' tails and create a different future for herself in China. But I think she knows that she doesn't have one. This is a famous pagoda in Shanghai called Longhao. And this photograph was in George's papers. I mean, he was there. And this is the same pagoda that goes in the barn. It's a famous place in China because the Buddha's bones are supposed to be there. And if you go inside, there's a whole temple complex around it and a garden full of peach trees that smell amazing, apparently. They're not there now. Now it's a mini mall wherever you look, but at the time it was a garden of peach trees. And there are these beautiful, beautiful jade statues of dragons. And if you go there during the Peach Festival, you give the dragon a gift that he'll grant a wish. So that becomes important to Ning. And back then, this is how you would get there. You would get there by a boat. My favorite scene in the book, and another one that was written many, many times, is their journey out of Shanghai to the palace. I mean, now there's a metro and Uber, but back then, that's how you did it. And you mentioned artifacts. All of these artifacts are part of the scaffolding I used to write the book. I didn't have as many facts as I normally do, so I thought a lot about the things that matter a lot to my mom. She has this necklace, and someday it will be mine, and then someday I will have to decide which of my two daughters gets it. But it's made of red coral and green jade, both very lucky things.
And this is what Nina brought with her. Her
Yes.
mother.
Her mother gave it to her for her journey to America. And every picture we have of her, she's wearing this necklace. So, and this doll. I have this doll, and it is sort of mind-blowing to think that a child carried this on a 6-month journey by boat. And this is where she ends up, in Baldwinsville, New York. There's Erastus and Sarah sitting on the porch of their very sturdy house, which is a mansion by Chinese standards. And Erastus had just built this beautiful barn. And it looks pretty big in this picture. It's even bigger in real life. It's still there. And this is a picture from the 1880s. This is what they ended up doing. This is the side of the property that faces the road. So everyone who drives by sees this pagoda. And I think this picture was taken to show us how prosperous they were. There's Nina in the cart on the left, and they've got several other oxen and horses. And Nina, you can see, is wearing the necklace. This is a picture of Nina as an old woman. I think she prospered. She had 9 children. Her husband left her, but she didn't seem to mind that much. This car was supposed to be one of the first in town. She was the first person to own one. And she never went back to China, but my mom did. My mom was the first to go back, and you can see she too is wearing the necklace. And I neglected to get a really good picture of myself wearing the necklace in front of the pagoda, which would have been smart. I know better now. So this is my picture in front of the pagoda, and that's when I was about 7 years old. And I love this picture. But my mom just told me today that when she took me to see that when we were 7, it was the first time she'd gone to see the pagoda. That in her family, it was not mentioned that they were Chinese. So her grandmother, who was Nina's daughter, when my mom asked about her family tree, her grandmother said, oh, well, I suppose I'll tell you, and gave her this whole story that my mother knew nothing about. And she grew up in Syracuse, about half an hour from here. So this family artifact is on a barn, not very far away, and she didn't see it till she was an adult, bringing me back to look for it.
You know, I think that that one of the challenges when you're writing historical fiction for kids is to create characters that our readers today can connect to. Mm-hmm. And so, well, first of all, what do you think are the aspects of Nina's story that a reader today would, there's so many universal themes, but I'd like to hear, that I felt, but I really want to hear in your mind what...
Well, I think the trick about writing historical fiction is to find the humanity in your character, because arguing with your mother is something that never goes away.
Yeah.
We've all had that experience, and whether it's in a little house in Shanghai or it's in a condo in the Upper West Side, but you've had that experience. So I think she's a regular kid. I think she's more resilient than most because she's had to struggle more. I think she's stubborn, and I love that about her. And I will tell you, it's a trait that runs in our family. And I think she's got great capacity for love. She didn't really get it from her mother, although I think her mother did care a great deal about her. But in China, she finds number one boy, who is the servant in their home. And he's called, it's a very odd title, number one boy. But in Shanghai, the British had imported this idea that the number one servant they would call number one boy. So when number one boy insists on calling himself that, he's putting on airs. But it's just son and her daughter and the servant. And the barriers have dropped a bit. So there's a lot of, really, those scenes were so much fun. I loved him. He was my favorite character.
I loved him too.
I mean, he's just funny.
Well, and he's the only he's her only refuge.
And he cares.
Yes, he
so
cares deeply
her.
about her. So I think that you had to create. That was such an important character.
If she didn't have that, it would have been tragic. But I needed to give her something to miss when she left.
Right.
One of my versions, she was just so angry with China for not accepting her for being half American and having green eyes. Like I do, my mom does, my daughters do. And my editor, she wrote a scribble in the outline saying, I think you need to give her something to miss. Because right now, it's like good riddance, China, and off she goes, and she's happy to leave. And that wasn't what I intended at all. So I had to go back and have her love certain things, and throughout she doesn't get out much because her mother's ashamed of her, but when she does, it's with wide eyes, and she's just so excited, and she's cataloging everything, and she's thinking about everything, and she's smelling everything and tasting, and it's very exciting for her, this country she's from. Yeah. And when she goes to America and she's asked to put it aside, she's like, oh, hold on, there were things I loved there, including number one boy. So at the beginning, every new thing she sees in America is filtered through, how would I tell number one boy about this?
Right. I loved that. And I think you also gave her a sense of security, then of course she arrives in Troy kind of unannounced in a way. And Sarah, her, your your other, how would you,
she would be my great grandmother.
Right. Was not pleased.
No, and she wouldn't have been.
Right.
I mean, this is in the 1870s in America, the Chinese were not welcome. The anti-Chinese rhetoric from San Francisco and California is coming. It's coming east, and we're heading into a big depression. So jobs are scarce, and people are looking for people to blame. It's the idea of the immigrant as scapegoat is not new, and she's walking into that and has no idea. She thinks that, well, at least I'm American, so I'm going to go here. But people look at her and they don't see American, they see Chinese.
Right.
So she's just stuck. So that's actually, I think I've gotten away from your question about universality, but I think that idea of being the stranger, of coming in and just desperate to try to fit in is important. But if she tries to fit in too much, she has to give up something that she's decided she values.
Right. So let's talk about this pagoda. So there's this painting on a barn in Troy, New York.
It's actually Baldwinsville.
In Baldwinsville.
It's much smaller than Troy.
Okay, so Baldwinsville, New York. And we know, or you're assuming, that her arrival was not celebrated, and there must have been prejudice. But at a certain point, it is decided that not only is she welcome to stay, but this is going to be celebrated, advertised. That this is going to be the family brand, in fact. Almost as a billboard for people going by.
The farm gets called Pagoda Hill.
So do you have any information on that transformation, or is...
I do not.
Yeah.
Which is startling, because it wasn't that long ago. If my mom heard the story from Nina's daughter, we should know something, but we don't.
Right.
But it's right there. So something happened, and I want to believe that it was this little girl creating a place for herself in the family with Sarah and Erastus. It's interesting because Sarah is actually Erastus' second wife. Mm-hmm. And for someone who's been brought up in China, kinship is everything, and blood is everything. So she's thinking, well, at some point there's going to be something that connects me to Sarah because, we're related. And when she finds out that Sarah is not related, she almost despairs because that was the one thing she was counting on. But I know in real life that Sarah and Nina were good friends. And after Nina's husband left her, Sarah moved in to help with the children. And there are pictures of the two of them where they're as close as mother and daughter. So I love that Nina came all this way and found a new family that was a lot healthier, I think, and a lot better for her.
And you do have proof of that. I mean, you do. You don't know much. You know nothing about the misery that you know she experienced as a child in China and this terrible journey. But you have confirmation that the end of her, that the latter part of her story was really a happy one.
Yeah, I think it was.
That's amazing.
And I think she made her own way. I mean, I love that picture of her with the car.
Well, tell us, okay, so wait. So her husband, she has 9 children. She marries the school teacher, right?
Mm-hmm.
She has 9 children. Then her husband leaves her for?
Her seamstress, who is her only friend in this book. I based it on the same character. I changed the name a little bit. But that's okay. That's small town living. That kind of thing happens.
Tell everyone about the church.
In what sense? I'm sorry.
Oh, that after her husband left her.
Oh, yes. If you want to just have an idea of what kind of clout Nina had in this town, her husband left her and married her seamstress, and they still went to the same church. And Nina was having none of that. So the minister would come and do a service for her at home privately, and then go to church and serve everybody else. So that kind of story just says to me, this is a woman who had things her own way. She figured it out. I think it would have made her mother proud. That son would have been very pleased to have someone who's so strong-willed.
I think that for kids reading this book, it's also a reminder that we all have family stories that are often tucked away, that are there for the asking. As you said, these were not stories that were, the story of Nina was not actively passed down. It had to be, it was tucked away.
Someone had to ask, and my mother loved it so much that, she raised us to think it was really interesting.
Right.
And, I'm hoping I'm doing the same for my kids. But there are so many other stories that we know nothing about that are gone, that we'll miss.
Well, for your children, too, I think that the stories of adversity, one of the most popular stories that I wrote this year in our magazines, in the magazines that I work on at Scholastic, that are used in classrooms, was about my grandmother's cousin who had polio as a child. And I wrote it during the pandemic, because I had shared a picture on Twitter of kids doing remote schooling in Chicago in 1937 during a pandemic, during a polio outbreak. And I got so many teachers who wrote and said, you need to do more, tell us more about this. So the idea that I think sharing that my grandmother's, the stories my grandmother told me about polio and about her cousin actually gave me a little bit of hope about the pandemic. We came out of the polio outbreaks, they found a vaccine, and we don't really even have to worry about that anymore. So I think does this story of Nina play a role, do you think, for your kids, your daughters? They must feel like, wow, we've got this amazingly strong woman in our family. I'm related to her.
Yeah, I really hope so. But I will say that, I have her encounter the kind of prejudice I think she would have encountered. And at first she sort of takes it and then decides, well, hold on, no. And clearly her family supports her, so she overcomes. But what was so discouraging for me is to read the same kinds of things being shouted at people of Asian descent now.
Yeah.
When you're writing historical fiction, you get lost in the past, and then it's a little shocking to turn on the news and see it happening still.
Right.
And that is so discouraging. So I think the book's coming at a good time. I don't identify as Asian American, but I have a story that's an American story about immigration and having a foot in both lands and maybe choosing. I think Nina chose to be American, but she had the right to choose. And so I'm glad that I can be a small part of the conversation now. I hover on the outside of that conversation because I don't want to. There are people's voices who I think need to be elevated more right now than mine. But I'm going to whisper, and I'm hoping that this story helps.
Well, it just also reinforces that, that the connectivity of all of our cultures. I mean, I never understand how, everyone in this country comes from somewhere else. And most families have these, these threads running through. So anyway, I just, I thought you did a remarkable job with your book. And it's, I think that there are so many things that teachers can get from this, great discussions and different doors that will kind of fling open in kids' minds that they're going to want to go through in terms of more learning. So
I hope so.
Yeah.
And that's always where I end up. If I can get even one kid to sit there and say, well, wait a minute, we weren't letting American or Asian women come into the United States in the 1800s. What was that about?
Right.
If they could just take that step. I was shocked to find out how long it was before those rules, the Anti-Asian Exclusion Act, how long it took to get that repealed. That went into my lifetime. That is not fully repealed until the 60s.
There's also really interesting history happening now where certain stories that are part of our American mythology, like the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, are being retold or refocused, recentered on the Chinese people who built them, and those stories have just those so in basically every major story of American history. There are so many people that are just left in the shadows that now we can explore and put into spotlights.
I think to some people that feels very threatening, to take away the story of the American manifest destiny. And of course we're going to build a railway. What do you mean we didn't build it?
Right.
We had these Chinese people come build it. But I've had this discussion with some people and I'm like, I think you've got to stop thinking of it as tearing down white male history and think of it as adding to the story. That, we live in this amazing culture that is so rich if we only look for all these different stories, and that it's a better view. I think a more noble country if we can look at every part of the story, and sure, some of our idols are going to get a little tarnished, but I would rather know the whole story.
Yeah. Well, you have told a lot in this one wonderful book. So are there any questions that we have, Jennifer?
We do actually have some questions from the audience watching from home. I'm going to start, however, with a statement that one of your friends sent. She says...
A statement. Is it an official statement?
It is an official statement. Thanks again for another important book. I've known of this wonderful story, family story, for some time now from your mom, and I really don't have a question. I just wanted to thank you for your amazing imagery and historical expertise while keeping true to your family's history. That isn't easy to pull off. So congratulations, Michaela, from somebody who's obviously read the book. Now we do have an actual question from Lewis, who says, you've done historical fiction before. This book has a very personal connection, I'm assuming. If my assumption is correct, can you talk about whether your craft of writing was made more or less challenging by having the story so personal?
Ooh, that's a good question.
It was a good question because I don't think I knew how hard it was. I just couldn't figure out why it wasn't coming as easy as the other books had. I really, really struggled. And my editor said, I've seen this before. It's because it's your family. I'm like, no, that's not the problem. And she's like, no, I really think that's the problem. And I think she was right. Part of it was I didn't want to disappoint my mom. But part of it was that I know that I was taking liberties. I always do. And it's what historical fiction is all about. We make up stories. We have a basis that we work from. We need our characters to be credible. We need our characters to be rooted in fact. But then we go to town. We do whatever we want with these people. And as long as we tell a story that's compelling, we get away with it. And then in the author's note, we tell everything that we've lied about. But it's different when it's your own family. I felt quite often that I had to take a step back and think of Ning and Nina, both their names, as a character rather than my great-great-grandmother.
That's a really interesting way of putting it, I think.
It took me a while to get there.
Yeah. Well, I think that sometimes, and I think this happens a lot when you're writing about history, is that sometimes one can become so focused on every little fact every person, all of that, that you lose the story. You lose the compelling story, and especially when we're writing for kids, we have to make sure that that the story is based in reality and all those historical details. But the beauty of historical fiction is that you can make up details to propel that story along. So
yeah, I think of historical fiction as I was telling you earlier, like a blanket that you tuck yourself into, and you get to live in this other world for a while. I once went to a seminar. It was several days long, so there were lots of different things to do. But the keynote speaker was talking about fantasy world building, and I was so tempted to skip it. I'm like, I don't do this. I do real stuff. I look for the real story. But then I had breakfast with her, and I sort of had to go. I couldn't get out of it, and I went. And it turns out the way she built a world was exactly the way I build a world. She thought about every kind of detail. In her case, she had to make it up, but in my case, I have to find it out. But it was the same thing. We're creating a world that kids can step into.
Well, and you're also, in this case, because a lot of the details are elusive, from that you're in a very challenging spot because you really don't have liberty to make up the background of this story, right? You have to adhere to fact as best you can. You can create the characters and their world in your plot, but so I think that must have been very challenging.
Well, most of my books have had more to work with.
Yeah.
And I'm really, really comfortable writing about famous people.
Yeah.
I love diving into a biography of a real person and finding a story that sort of, twists and turns around the facts. I love that. So this was much harder.
Yeah.
I had fewer facts, and I had somebody that, metaphorically was going to smack me on the head if I got it wrong. So.
Okay, so we have one more question here. This one is more about your process of writing. So, Michaela, would you tell us a little bit of somehow of how you write your books and do the research? And do you go in with, do you make all of the chapters make it up in advance, or do you write it as you go?
Okay, in our world, the jargon is, do you pants it by the seat of your pants, or do you outline? And I'm an outliner. I don't think I've ever written a book where I didn't see the end, where I wasn't aiming for a scene that I could see very clearly. So when I start, I read a lot, and I have notebooks full of ideas and bits of dialogue and chunks about characters. But when I start to outline, I come up with something that works. Some parts of it are clunky. I don't really care. It's just, this kind of scene, this scene, till I get to that final scene that I can see. And then I never look at it again. For me, it's enough to know that I've charted a path, that I can get there. And if I had to, I could pull out this Excel spreadsheet from, a year ago and use it, but I usually don't have to. So I'm sort of in between. I'm not one of these writers that lets the characters tell them where to go. I mean, I would find my characters impossibly bossy if they did that. I'm the writer, I'm in charge. But I do let the scenes go where they need to go. And sometimes what you plan just doesn't work once you've written the dialogue.
Well, until you were sharing about the scene on the boat in this book, where you tried it many, many ways and then had to completely abandon your plan. Yeah,
there's a journey. I'd originally envisioned this book as 3 pieces. There's our time in Shanghai, and there's our time in America, and the journey. How do you skip the journey? I wrote it as a journal. I wrote it as poetry. I wrote it as prose. I tried different points of view, and nothing worked. It was so frustrating.
It's so dispiriting.
Yeah, it really is. I mean,
it's really
to throw out 50 pages and say, yeah, it doesn't work. But I think I actually had to do it because the real issue for me was her relationship with her father. And every time I wrote it, what I was really rewriting was what her potential history with her father was, because we don't know that much about them. Did she become friends with him? Did they find some common ground? Did they spend the whole time avoiding each other on a small boat, which didn't seem likely? And ultimately, I had a friend say to me, well, why does he have to go on the boat with her at all? I'm like, well, because she's 12. How can she walk? And my friend said, well, wouldn't it be terrible? And when we write, especially for kids, we're always looking for the most terrible thing that we can do to these people, that they can still survive, but something terrible, because that's how they grow. That's how they show that they're resilient. So you have to have them suffer. And once I did that, I was like, oh, that creates so much tension. How could you watch a father abandon a daughter he barely knows for a 6-month journey on a ship with a chaperone that she's just been introduced to and not turn the page? But then the idea of having her on the boat with a chaperone, it just wasn't that interesting. So the next section starts, they're in view of New York.
Wasn't that just like a great moment? Like, I know what I'll do. I've got it. I'll do
lovely.
nothing. And they're going to see, and it's going to be great. No, it's true.
But it took many, many passes.
Well, you have to. I mean, I think that is the, I think that the more experienced I get as a writer, the better I feel. I won't say great, but the better I feel about all the drafts, because you understand that even though it's not a waste of time.
Nothing is wasted.
It's right, and it's a circuitous journey that is taking you somewhere. So,
yeah. But still, hitting delete is hard.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
We do have another question from the audience. Have you ever been tempted to write purely nonfiction biography of someone?
I'm trying that now with a picture book biography, where you're everything has to be true, and it's really, really hard. I mean, it's sort of dispiriting how hard it is not to lie, because that's what we do when we write fiction. We're lying all the time, but it's interesting. There's a genre called narrative nonfiction, where you're stringing together a story out of truth, and I'm trying to learn how to do it. I will say once I did try to write a biography of Beryl Markham, and I was terrible at it, because every time I got to something interesting that had happened in her life, I started writing dialogue. And I turned that into a novel called Promise the Night that did pretty well. So I'm not sure that I'm cut out for nonfiction, but I'm hoping that narrative nonfiction might have a little room for me.
And can you talk about your next project? I'm assuming that you have something lined up.
This pandemic intervened. So I have written a picture book biography that I'm about to shop. So hopefully the next time I come back, it will be with a new project.
Excellent. Well, I would like to thank both Lauren and Michaela today for coming into the library and sharing this amazing story with us. And thank you at home for watching as well. Remember, you can still purchase a copy of View from Pagoda Hill through the next few hours through the link on the registration webpage, or borrow a copy from the library. Remember to watch westportlibrary.org for future and recorded events, and thank you all, and you all, for coming today.